Welcome to How to Talk to Kids About Anything with Dr. Robyn Silverman, a podcast loaded with practical tips, powerful scripts, personal stories, and simple steps to make even the toughest conversations easier. So get ready to get the information you need to make the impact you want from someone you trust, your friend, parenting expert, Dr. Robyn Silverman.
Hello and welcome to How to Talk to Kids About Anything, where we give you the tips, scripts, stories, and steps to make even the toughest conversations easier. I'm so honored to be your host, Dr. Robyn Silverman, child and teen development specialist, author, and speaker, and most importantly, parent of two great kids who give me the opportunity to love, learn, and grow every single day, whether I want to or not. Believe me, I get it. It's not always easy, but we're in this together, and we have some great people helping us along the way. Now, why do children play sports? According to a study by researchers at Notre Center for Ethical Education, it's to, number one, have fun, and then do something that they're good at, improve skills, get exercise, be part of a team, and enjoy the excitement of competition. But looking at many sports fields and sports floors, athletic events, sometimes if we're being truthful, it looks like we may be missing the mark. There are coaches screaming or parents gritting their teeth, fans yelling at referees, teammates shunning their teammates over missed goals or botched moves. What happened to the carefree freedom and fun of sports and athletic engagements that we once saw or once was part of? It's no wonder so many kids drop out of sports by the age of 13. And if we are really going to ask ourselves the honest questions about how we can develop strong athletes who thrive at peak performance, do we really think that this is the way? My next guest has some other ideas that can really help us. John O'Sullivan started the Changing the Game project in 2012 after 2 decades as a soccer player, collegiate and professional, and a coach of the youth, high school, college, and professional level. He is the author of the #1 best-selling books, Changing the Game, The Parent's Guide to Raising Happy, High-Performing Athletes, Giving Youth Sports Back to Our Kids, and Is It Wise to Specialize? John's work has been featured in the Huffington Post, CNN.com, Outside Magazine, ESPN.com, Soccer America, and numerous other publications. John is the internationally known speaker for coaches, parents, and youth sports organizations, and has spoken for TEDx, the National Soccer Coaches Association of America, U.S. Lacrosse, IMG Academy, and at numerous other events throughout the U.S., Canada, Asia, and Europe. He has a popular podcast for coaches called Way of the Champions and has even consulted with the U.S. Olympic Committee. John clearly has so much to offer us about sports and our children, so I just want to welcome John to How to Talk to Kids About Anything.
Thank you so much for having me on and for that great introduction.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I would love it before we get into the meat of the interview, if you could just tell us what gets you up in the morning and what got you so interested in kids, sports, and changing the face of the game for kids.
Well, probably much like you, what gets me up in the morning is my kids.
No kidding.
Trying to get them off to school. I always say my most important job is as the parent of an 11 and a 13-year-old. So that's my thing. But my passion is taking the things that I learned as an athlete and as a coach, taking the things that I've learned as an avid reader and researcher and student of things like skill acquisition, psychology, sociology, team environments, team dynamics, and all the brilliant people I get to talk to on my podcast, and sort of being this instrument that takes it and distills it down and passes it on to other people so that they can coach better or parent better and help, their own athletes through this athletic journey, but also through their life journey. And so that's really what gets me out of bed every morning.
Excellent. And I know you've had some pivotal moments where you've realized that something has kind of gone wrong. Clearly, we have coaches and parents or fans who may be, feeling like sports really isn't about fun anymore. It's if they're yelling or teasing or putting a lot of pressure on people, it can change the mindset around sports. So I'd love for you to talk about mindset a bit and what we need to transfer from maybe that limited fixed mindset that we now have about sports, and one that's quite negative, to one that might be more of this high performing mindset that you talk about that we really need in order to succeed in sports.
Yeah, 100%. I think the main thing in this idea that you touched on about fun, or, fun's a word that maybe younger kids would use. And then as we become later teenagers and adults, we might use the word joy or enjoyment. Mm-hmm. And this idea that, sport can either be competitive or it can be fun is the most ridiculous idea out there. Kids and adults will participate in things that they enjoy. And if the enjoyment factor goes away, they're going to walk away. And that's just a plain fact. And I challenge anyone to say, what do you do? If you get people don't love their jobs if it's just a job, right? They love it when it's an environment and people that they love to show back up and do stuff over and over with. And this is what we have to do in sports. And so this idea of enjoyment has to be at the center of everything that we do when it comes to our kids in sport, when it comes to our kids in theater, in art, in dance, in everything, right? What makes you want to come back? Because the competition for soccer isn't lacrosse, it's Fortnite.
No kidding.
And it's social media. And so we have to outperform these multi-billion-dollar companies that spend tens of millions of dollars a year on research that says, how can we make this better so you'll do it more, right? And then actually implements it. And so that's our challenge. And so it starts, if we put joy and the needs of the child at the center of everything we do sports-wise, then all of a sudden we start getting closer to this environment that makes them want to come back. And it doesn't mean that it can't be competitive. It doesn't mean it can't be demanding. Those are all words that kids use to describe things that make it fun. Trying hard, demanding, challenging games. That's fun for kids.
So give us the landscape of what you've been seeing that kind of triggered you to say, we need a change. And then give us kind of your vision of what you hope to see in place of that.
Well, I think the landscape and the number that's thrown about quite often is this idea that about 3/4 of children are done with organized sports by middle school. And so that's the landscape that I'm really sad about, because at the same time that kids are walking away from sport, we have schools that have cut recess and cut PE, in spite of all the evidence that shows how important movement and activity is to not only learning, but lifelong good, positive health outcomes. So sport is this opportunity to keep kids moving and train them correctly and so that they become active for life. So that's the environment. And then, the subsets of that environment are, toxic coaching that doesn't treat the kids well or doesn't focus on their needs and wants from the game. Toxic sidelines, parents yelling and screaming and only focused on today and not the long-term development in the sport, yelling at referees and things like that, coaching kids from the sideline and not letting them learn and make decisions themselves. And then just, sporting environments. Like the other day, I saw an advertisement, AAU is running a 7 and under national championship for basketball. That's insane. There's no benefit for the kids there. That's just about, hey, we're going to exploit you to make money, right? So that's the environment that we're trying to change, and really change it to one where we have healthy competition, right? Where we have less barriers to entry for sport, either financial, time commitment, life balance. So you don't have things like specialization and stuff like that before it's scientifically good to do. And an inclusiveness in sport, and then actually where our sport development matches the science and the psychology and the sociology of best principles of developing athletes for the long term, because most of what we do now goes directly against what gives athletes the best chance of performing over the long term.
Okay, we're going to be getting into that, and I really appreciate what you're saying, and I think that those who are listening, since we have so many coaches and instructors listening to this podcast from the perspective of how can I make things good for the kids that are coming to me several times a week, my next question has a real personal interest to me and many of the coaches, instructors, and teachers that I work with throughout the country and in many other countries, because I have a program called Powerful Words, which is a character education program that I write for after-school sports activities and have done so for more than 15 years now. You write about, in your book, shifting the paradigm of competitive physical activities in sports from one that focuses on winning and perfection and sort of being the best to one that focuses on character and core values like grit and commitment, integrity, humility, fairness, excellence, self-control, just to name a few. And since my Powerful Words community is listening in and they focus on a different core value and powerful word every month, many of which I just mentioned, I thought this would be a really important thing to cover, and so glad you wrote about it. So how, in your eyes, can we as parents and coaches and instructors help this paradigm shift to happen? What tips or takeaways would you like our listeners to come away with where they can implement right now, moving a paradigm that focuses on winning to one that's focusing on character and what you were just talking about, the development of that athlete over time?
Well, I would say the first and best thing we could do is stop using professional sport as a model for youth sport. Right. I mean, professional sport is sport for entertainment. Right. Youth sport is sport for development. Right. So they have two very different needs and things that they value. Number two, the little snippets of professional sport that we see on ESPN are not the majority of time that those coaches spend with athletes, that those athletes spend with each other, developing bonds and friendships and teams and respect for each other, so that in the moment when that coach raises their voice, it's done out of love, not out of fear. So I think that's the biggest thing, because when sport is for entertainment and your job is solely based upon winning, well, you know, what happens? We cut corners, right? And that's where you have things like what happened with U.S. gymnastics. And that's where you have doping. And that's where you have cheating scandals, because it's all about winning. But that's not what youth sports should be about. And sadly, we see that, you know, with, you know, little league teams registering illegal players or you know, basketball teams, you know, forging age you know, to get a kid onto their team. And so this is where we can't use high level sport as the model for youth sport. They're two very different things, because the participants have very different needs, right? We don't use college as the model for what a kindergarten classroom should look like. Right?
Good point.
And so then, you know, to build on your character education program, I think what's really important, and, you know, there's a great coach educator named Joe Ehrman out there, and he said this to me once, and it really, really resonated. He said, you know, it's a big myth that sport develops character, because there's two types of character, you know, in his words. There's performance character and there's moral character. Now, sport, to an extent, can develop performance character, and that's things like grit and resilience, right? If you're trying to do 10 pull-ups and the most you've done is 8, you're developing resilience by just trying to do that 9th pull-up, right? But when we look at things like moral character, integrity, respect, all those sort of things, that doesn't happen by accident just because you signed up for soccer. That only happens when sports organizations and coaches intentionally teach it.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't happen by osmosis. You have to teach it. Yes.
Yeah, what happens is what they see. So if you don't learn positive moral character if your coach or the parents on the sideline are disrespectful to the official.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
or teach you to cheat. Right.
Right.
And so if we are going to truly teach character through sport, then we must intentionally teach it every day.
You and I are totally on the same page on that. I have had that conversation multiple times, hundreds, maybe thousands of times over the last 15 years. And I couldn't agree more. We have to be intentional, and it actually needs to come out of our mouths. We need to show it. We need to highlight it when we see it. And, when we're teaching kids about what respect looks like in sports, what it looks like what sportsmanship looks like, but also how they can carry it home and be responsible and be respectful to the people in their neighborhoods and their communities and their families. And yes, of course, their teammates and everybody that they encounter when they're at our schools, our gyms, or out on the sports field. That's the gold. That's when we are really developing something that I find is not just helpful in the athletics, but it's helpful in life. They take it with them, and the kid who is playing soccer or doing gymnastics or cheer or martial arts or football takes that with them and applies it while they're a kid and they're an athlete. And then when they're an adult and they may no longer be an athlete, they still can apply it, and they can still say, I learned this from my participation in sports.
Exactly. And it's why many people in C-level jobs have a sporting background, because it's about the ability to recognize each other's differences and work together towards a common goal, whether that's trying to win a soccer championship or, trying to run a company. It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. People are people, whether they're chasing a ball or chasing sales figures. Mm-hmm. So I think this is incredibly important that we understand this. And the fact is that no matter how good a coach you are, only a tiny percentage of your athletes will ever make a living from the sport that you're teaching.
Yes.
But every one of them will have the opportunity to use the things that you teach them in some aspect of their life. Mm. So if the only thing that you're teaching is, how to hit a curveball, you're really selling your kids short.
So well said. That's absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I love what you're saying here. Now, I know that we just talked about that so many kids are dropping out of sports, really what we think of as prematurely. I mean, they're still kids. 70% of kids are dropping out of sports by age 13. So can you tell us why children are quitting? And this will really perk up every coach and instructor that's listening right now. Give us the scripting of what you would say to a child who tells you, or his parents, or, his coach, that he or she wants to quit.
So part one of that question, for sure, why kids are quitting, I really think that the number one, obviously, if the number one reason they play is enjoyment, then the number one reason they quit is because I just don't enjoy this anymore.
Right.
Number two, I think kids quit because they lose ownership of the experience, right? So their parents or their coaches are trying to live vicariously through their athletic achievements, and they start making all the decisions and deciding, hey, this is what you're going to do and all these things. And so they've lost ownership of the experience. They've lost ownership of, I want to go out and practice, right? I always say to people when they think, ask me, they think my kid's going to be good. I'm like, well, do they pick up a ball outside of practice? Because if they don't, then no. The answer is no.
Right.
Right. But if they pick up a ball outside of practice, there's something there that, they are intrinsically motivated to get better. And that's a really good sign at a young age that a child has a chance of doing something long enough to actually get good at it. Right. So I think that's the starting point. And then, to the second part of your question, if someone comes, if a child says to you, that I want to walk away, right? And they're really young, right? And so let's say they're 7 and they're trying soccer for the first time, and 2 weeks in, they're like, I don't want to play soccer anymore. you're walking that line, I think, as a coach, but especially as a parent, of saying, you know what, if you've gone out there and the environment's good and the coach is not a lunatic, right? Like, we're also learning about commitment here. Like, hey, you know what? We made a commitment.
Yep.
You're going to fulfill your commitment. At the end of it, we don't ever have to sign up for soccer again.
Right.
But at least you're going to try.
Right.
Right. So I think that's an important part of it.
Yes.
Number two, I heard a guy named Tim Elmore once asked this same question. I thought he gave a really good answer, and so I'll give him credit for it. I think his website's Growing Leaders.
Yes, I interviewed him.
Oh, okay, perfect. So he said, I don't know if you asked him the same question, but he said, well, tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, right? 10 being this is the greatest thing ever, and 1 being I don't want to ever do it again. Where are you on that scale? And most people aren't a 1, right? They're like a 3 or a 4. And so you say to them, like, hey, well, why aren't you a 2? Well, because I like this and like that. So you can start turning the conversation onto the positives of what's good about this. And, well, what would make it a 6? What would get it to 7? Well, if, we played more games in practice instead of standing in line, things like that. This is really good feedback for coaches about what your players want versus what you think they need. And so I think that's good. And, one of the times that I think if your kids stay in sport long enough, every parent will go through this. And oftentimes it happens like after an injury, right? So a kid tears an ACL, and so they're 9 months out of the game, and then they start back and they feel like they're not really good anymore. Well, it's because you missed 9 months and you had a significant injury. And so, giving them the advice of, well, how about this? Stick with your comeback, do your physical therapy, and when you get back to the level that you think you were at before you got hurt, and if you still want to quit, then you can, right? But usually by that point, kids start feeling progress,
right?
Right, and then they're like, no, this is good. Like I'm feeling good about myself again. So I think as parents, we're always walking that line between giving them that positive push and sort of saying, okay, well, fair enough, right? And at certain ages, right, they might, I really love music, or I really love theater, and I just can't do both. Or, you know what, I can't play soccer because I really love basketball. And, if you're 14 and that's your choice, I think that's okay. But probably not in the middle. Like, don't let your teammates down in the middle of the thing. But then, the last piece is, as the parent, if this situation is a dangerous one, the coach is a bully, the team dynamics are awful, your kid's developing an eating disorder or depression because of this environment, then get them out.
Right. If it's that toxic environment, then
it's toxic. If it's dangerous, not just difficult.
Right. Okay. Really great scripting and extremely helpful. And I think that it is a great lesson for our coaches and our instructors and our teachers to be able to ask that question that you mentioned, that Tim Elmore said about the scale from 1 to 10. I like that, and helping them to define for themselves, what those different levels would look like, so that we can see if there's ways that we can improve what the experience we're providing. And for parents, if they have their child in a very competitive situation and the child is not enjoying that competition, that they can then seek out maybe a more non-competitive way of them being involved in that activity. Or I'll just say, in my case, my daughter was just in a gymnastics class that she was finding to be more frustrating because it had gotten quite large, and she was feeling like it really wasn't a great environment. Well, we, just called and talked to somebody at the front desk about the other classes that were provided. And she said, there's a smaller class that meets at a different time. And we moved her. She's much happier now. So sometimes it's a small move that can help, move it to that next level from a 4 to a 7 or an 8. And other times it's, is it coach related? Is it, related to the actual environment itself? Or are they, really, as you said, more interested in something else at that time, and they're old enough to, really make that choice and say, I'm really interested in theater or art and want to put my effort there.
Yeah, and just having the ability to have that conversation with your kids about that is an incredibly important thing. And that's something that you develop early on when you are making most of the decisions for them. And then it's something that you're gradually ceding them that responsibility later and later. There was a study out of Europe. It's the only one I've ever seen about, when parents have unfulfilled dreams, that they're more likely to live vicariously through their children. And I think it's a really important thing to recognize that if the thought that's always in the back of your head is, I could have made it if I just had A, B, and C, that's a really, good sign that you're taking over this experience for your son or your daughter, and you might need to just take a deep breath. It doesn't mean that you don't have expectations of them to work hard or whatever, but realistically, unless they feel it in their gut and they love it and they're willing to get out there and do it more and more, they're probably not going to be a real high-level athlete, which is okay. They can still be a runner and a biker and town basketball league player. That's great, but they're not going to the Olympics.
Right. That's something that's really got to come from the gut, that somebody who is really committed and intrinsically motivated to go into that level. I know that a large portion of your work focuses on what you call the 7 C's of high performance state of minds. So I'd love for you to talk about these 7 C's sort of in general and how they impact our children's approach to sports, their sort of investment in sports, and their decision to stick with sports. What are these 7 C's of high performance?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we have to realize is that the single greatest factor that affects performance, and performance can be playing well versus not playing well, and performance can also be continuing to participate or not participate, is the environment and the state of mind of the participant, right? And so as a parent or as a coach, we play a large part in what that environment and what their state of mind is towards our sport. And so the book is the gist of the book is basically about, hey, what are these 7 areas that if we are intentional about creating the right environment, children will continue to participate and it'll also free them up to perform their very best. So it starts with, common sense and perspective. That's the first C. It starts with giving them control and ownership, which, helps them develop competence. And when they develop competence, that's where confidence comes from. When we create the right conditions, right? So that's physically and emotionally safe, developmentally appropriate environments. When we communicate correctly, I wrote the communication chapter with a friend of mine who's a hostage negotiator. I'm like, if anyone can talk to teenagers, right? It's a hostage negotiator, right? And then caring and unconditional love. And so if you see your son or your daughter pulling away from sport, you can look in any one of those areas and say, okay, what is it? Are they lacking confidence? Let me dive in and look what affects confidence and how I can, get that back. And it just might be, well, I feel like everyone's better than me. Well, hey, you're going to have to practice a little bit more. If it's, communication, if the car ride home for them is something that they fear and loathe because you're trying to make it a teachable moment, even though it's the least teachable moment, that's something that you can strip away and give that space back to them so that it doesn't become something to avoid. And so really the whole book was about giving all these aspects and areas that you can look in when performance is lagging, or you can look at your own interaction with your athlete and say, maybe I need to pull back a little bit there, versus giving more. And so, there's like questions to talk about with your kids and activities to do to help have this great back and forth and understanding of each other in these situations.
You're making me think of, I interviewed KJ Dell'Antonia, who was,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So she was talking about how there was a study out there that said that the part of sports that kids hated the most was the ride home after. And so, it can feel, I think for kids, that they're right in the spotlight, and it can be a very negative spotlight of, when you do this, then you've got to do that. And there was a point in the game when you did this and you should have been doing that, and how unpleasant that can be in the car. What do you recommend for parents when the kid gets in the car and they're on their way home from a sports event of any kind? What would you recommend that conversation or that communication looks like?
Well, I think first of all, you have to take into account their own state of mind in that moment, right? If they just won and they're feeling good, let them feel good for a while, right? If they just lost, they already feel lousy, right? What's your goal?
This now.
To make them feel worse, right? Right. So these are, two of the pieces, and then realistically, let your son or your daughter guide the conversation. So, for example, my daughter often after a game gets in the car and is like, "How do you think I did, Dad?" Right? And I'm also at this point her coach, and so my first answer is usually, "Would you like me to answer as your dad or as your coach?" Right? Because my job as your dad sometimes to make you feel better. My job as your coach is to make you be better. So two different answers, right?
There you go.
And but she'll always ask it. My son, that question never occurs to him. He'll never bring it up. He never wants to talk about it. He's more, what's for lunch, right?
Yes.
And he's moving on. And so with him, I have to find times later on the emotions out of the moment for him and for me and say, "Hey, is there anything, you want to chat about at the game? What went well? What needs work?" Things like that, we can find that unemotional time. And I think, you said you have coaches listening.
Yes.
This is the post-game talk. What do you actually have to say right after the game when you're angry or upset or super disappointed that you can't say in the hotel that night or before the next practice when your players are actually ready to learn and you're ready to teach, right? Usually after the game, it's like, what comes out of your mouth is like vomit. Like it makes you feel better and everyone else feels worse.
Oh, gosh, that is such a good point. And I think parents know that too, not just in the sports arena, but like right there in the moment when they're really frustrated with their child, that feeling of vomiting all over to them. And you're like, probably not the best time to have said these words.
And I think it's really appropriate for people to understand that there's certain things that I think you do deal with directly, right? If your son or your daughter, punches a player in the face off the ball, if they curse at a referee, they do something that's, hey, this is not how our family does things.
Yes.
You address that right away, like parent to child,
right?
Not coach to athlete, right? You address that and then you put it to bed. It's not a segue into then discussing the performance during the game, but you just address inappropriate behaviors like, hey, you know what? We always shake hands no matter what.
Right.
Address that immediately, but then put it to bed.
Right.
But anything performance related, unless your kid brings it up, I suggest don't bring it up in the car.
Okay. You talked about these 7 C's, but then you later talk about long-term athletic development, and you mentioned it before, and we're trying to develop the athlete who is going to grow up to love sports and not drop out. So what would you say are some key factors of that LTAD, as you call it, long-term athletic development, that we really need to consider that would help to inspire high performers and long-term athletes?
The LTAD framework came out of Canada. In the United States, we were calling it the American Development Model. So if you see ADM or you see LTAD, they refer to sort of the same thing. And it's basically around this idea of what we would call physical literacy, right? So we have, we talk about literacy in terms of being able to, to read and write. And we would never, have a 5-year-old who was struggling with reading and we would just say, you know what, she's just not a reader. Let's move on. Right. But we have 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds who struggle with fundamental movement, how to run, jump, skip, throw, catch, track, and yet we say, he's just not an athlete.
Right.
She's just not an athlete. But these are learned skills. Now, oftentimes the kids who we look at as like the better athletes, yes, some of them have genetic advantages, but a lot of times they're just older, right?
Yes.
So if the cutoff date is January 1st for Little League and your kid's born in December, your kid's always going to probably look like a lesser athlete than the kid's born in January, right? But these are learned skills. So these give us opportunities as parents to go in the backyard and work on jumping, throwing, catching, climb that tree, fall out of that tree. That's okay. And so when we talk about a long-term athlete development path, it's basically looking at the social, emotional, physical needs of the child at different ages, and then providing a sporting and movement environment that is appropriate for those ages and stages. And, I just wrote a blog post called The Professionalization of Youth Sports. When we start, trying to put 18-year-old demands on 8-year-olds, those kids walk away or they get injured, or it's just too much for them, and I think this is where these type of frameworks are good. From a physical standpoint, when kids are very young, you should be teaching speed and agility, not go for a 4-mile run, because kids in that stage are, they'll learn movement quicker than they'll be able to develop aerobic fitness. Aerobic fitness is something, aerobic capacity develops faster later once you hit puberty. But before puberty, it's speed, right? And so, when I see a bunch of 8-year-olds running laps, I'm like, there's someone who has no idea what they're doing.
Oh, so we really need to be aware of their capabilities and of what is really healthy for their bodies and their minds at each individual age group.
Yeah. And as you know from your work, I mean, you can't tell a 7-year-old be a leader. Like that means nothing to a 7-year-old. Right. And when we say to, 6-year-old soccer players spread out because there's the big beehive, it's like, well, they're not going to spread out. If you put 8 kids in your living room and gave them one toy, they'd all fight for the toy.
Very good point.
Right.
It's
right.
Classic.
They don't have visual spatial awareness of where I am versus my teammates.
Yes.
Right. So unless we are clever enough to put constraints in our practices that artificially make them spread out. So when I work with 6 or 7-year-olds, we never play to one goal. Each end of the field has 2 goals and they're out by the corners. And so this allows, players who maybe are a little bit ahead to go, there's a lot of people here, but there's no one over there. And look, I can score there too.
Oh, so smart. So smart. So that would be a challenge to some coaches and instructors who are listening, that how can we translate some of the fundamentals that we want them to learn in a fun way without telling them these sort of elusive directions like spread out or whatever it may be, and help to then teach them kinesthetically in a fun way that would actually translate to kids. I think that's genius. I love that idea.
Yeah. And I think, if we think about a child board game, and I'll just throw one out there like Chutes and Ladders, whatever, right? That, as an adult, you might get no joy in playing that with your kid. Well, why would you think that a kid gets joy playing an adult game when they're just a kid, right? Like it has to fit the needs of who's in front of me and not the needs of who's teaching.
No. Wow, that's a good one. That will be slapped on a meme for later, I'm sure of it. Love that. So if you were running a family meeting about sports participation, let's say your children are now going to get into a sport. you're running a family meeting about it. Like, what would be like one of your top things that would be on your list to talk about, given the fact that, when they're involved with a sport that does, change some of the family dynamics. Somebody's got to drive, somebody's got to be there, there's got to be an idea about attitude and we're embarking on something, we're signing up for something that's going to take a couple of weeks, months, whatever. What would be some of your top things that you would want to relay to a child who's then embarking on some kind of sport or athletic event?
I think it depends on ages and stages. So let's just start when my kids were young and they're just starting out and they're sampling lots of sports. We'd say, we really have sort of 3 goals for this, right? Which is have fun, try your best, and fulfill your commitment, right? Like we're committing to this for whatever, right? So no, I'm not going to sign you up for, 42 straight weeks of soccer. Right? Like, let's just do 10 and see how that goes. And then we'll try something else.
Right.
And if you liked it, then great, we'll try something else and then we'll come back to soccer later on. So I think that's early on. As they get into, a little older and middle school ages, then, it can be around their goals as well. And when you're getting into things like, do we play in the town recreational league, or do we make this jump in commitment and finances to, let's call it a travel program, right? Well, those are, I want you to play soccer, but these are 2 very different programs. So if we're going to commit, like you said, the driving and the resources to this, then as a child, recognize what you're committing to, which is more than if you just wanted to play in town, right? And so if your coach says, hey, twice a week, you need to, get outside in your backyard and work on this, then that's an expectation of this program that you signed up for. And I think that's really important. And I think as parents, we also have the right to look at our kids and say, you want to play here, but your commitment level is only over here. And so we're not going to keep paying $3,000 when 85 would do just fine.
Valid point. All right, before we get to our top tip and round up this incredible talk on sports, I was so curious about this while I was reading your book. If you heard a coach or a parent screaming at their child or yelling at their child or, reprimanding their child about how they were performing on the field or on the sports floor while doing their sport of choice, what would you want to whisper in their ear?
Would this be helpful at work for you? Right? Or like, I always say like we get in other parts of our kids' lives, like we don't go to math class and yell at them to carry the 1, right? And my kids play music, and I've never been to a concert where some parent jumped up and was like, the woodwinds are killing us tonight, right? And so, why do we think it's helpful for our child to be yelled at and berated and coached in the middle of them trying to do something very difficult, which is, motor skill development in a very public place? Now, sports is really one of the only places where parents get to watch their child succeed and fail firsthand, right? And so we want to intervene out of love, not because we're trying to mess them up. But I just say, if the Canadian, in my TED Talk, I showed a video of from Canadian hockey of a dad trying to hit a 10-foot putt and his kid standing behind him, bend your knees, keep your head still, do this to that, right? And the dad being this, what are you doing? Keep your eye on the ball, right? And I think they did a great job there of saying, if it's not okay here, why do you think it's okay if those roles were reversed?
Yes, it was great. Yes.
Yeah, and so I love that. Yeah. And I'll share a funny story for your listeners.
Yes.
My son loves to play golf. And I wasn't being a great golf dad because I love to play golf too. But I don't think there's any sport more than golf where you could make 52 coaching points on every swing. I was really struggling to be quiet for my son. He finally looks at me and I was like, should I just be quiet? And he's like, yes, let me just play. I'm like, okay, fair enough. Right. So 2 holes later, he hits his drive off to the side and he's going to hit his second shot and he's lined up straight at this tree like 8 feet in front of him. And I'm sitting there going, oh, if he hits this straight, it's going to whack that tree. And I almost said something. I'm like, he told me to be quiet. And so he takes his full swing, hits it square, hits the tree, it comes bouncing back, flies over his head. He ducks and falls, and he kind of looks back at me like shocked. I was like, well, you were aiming at the tree. And he says, why didn't you tell me? I'm like, because you told me not to. And he's like, okay, fair enough.
Fair enough,
right?
Yeah.
And so we came to this agreement, like, hey, I'll leave you alone.
Yes.
You wallow through this yourself. But it was really funny because I'm like, he's going to hit that tree.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say anything.
Well, impressive that you didn't say anything and allowed him to fail.
He hit himself and get a black eye.
Yes.
And my wife was like, what did you do to TJ?
And why didn't you say something?
Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. Well, sometimes failure is a great teacher, and I know that you're big on that too, making sure that the kids can fail. Why don't you give us your top tip, your single best piece of advice that you would want parents or coaches to come away with about sports participation and changing the game?
So I would say this, that there's 3 critical ingredients for your child to participate in sport long enough to actually get good at, but just to stay in the game, right? Number 1 is enjoyment. Number 2 is ownership. Number 3 is intrinsic motivation. And so as a parent, right, I should always be asking myself, do they own this? Are they here for them, right? Are they loving what they're doing, right? And do they seem motivated to get better and do more? And I think if you check in with those 3 things, that's really important. And oftentimes, just like sort of the theme of my TED Talk and the best advice I ever got as a dad is the best thing we can do is just tell our kids, I love watching you play. I love skiing with you. I love going camping with you. I love playing golf with you, right? And that's all I ever say to my kids. And when they want coaching, I give them coaching, but I always lead with that, right? I'm proud of the fact that you're out there, even if it wasn't your best day.
And it takes the pressure off of the winning and the losing and, feeling like you're in a fishbowl where everybody's watching every move you're making. It's just that you love watching them play. You love watching them get out there, and that they know that then you're there for a very different reason. You're not there because you feel like you're trying to live vicariously through them. You're not there because you're going to be embarrassed if they lose, or you're going to just put in so much pressure on the fact that, if they win, and then they can keep moving up a level. And they know that you're there for the right reasons. And of course, if you love watching them play, then it's much more of a likelihood that they'll love playing for you.
Exactly. And want you to actually attend their game.
Yes, exactly. And when I mean playing for you, I don't mean like playing because of you, but playing, while you're watching. That's really, it's such an important idea. And I like the idea of just being able to say, I love watching you play. It was advice that I was given too a long time ago, and I think it's very good, sound advice.
Yes.
Can you give us your resource of the week? Where can people get more information about you, your book, your speaking engagements, and everything you bring to the table on this topic?
Sure. So the hub of all things Changing the Game Project is just changingthegameproject.com. So that's our website. It's got our blog. It's got a link to the podcast. It's got online courses and how to book a speaker, or our schedule of where we are speaking, all that sort of stuff. Tons and tons. Hundreds of thousands of words of free blog posts and hundreds of hours of free podcasts on all this stuff. And if you don't mind, I would love. One of the things I love to do, my book's been out a number of years now, and I just like to get it in people's hands. And so if they want a PDF of the book, just go to changingthegameproject.com/free CTG book, all lowercase, and they just put in their email, and they get the book.
Oh,
so
great.
they can read it there, and then if they like it, then they can always go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or one of those and buy a copy.
Oh, that's terrific. And anybody who's driving or walking or jogging, don't worry, we've got you covered. I've got the show notes right there on my website, so there'll be links to all of John's work, his book, his blog posts, and his TED Talk and everything else that you'll need. And I just want to thank you, John. I'm just so appreciative of your insight and your strategies. I love what you're doing about changing the game and helping parents and educators and coaches sort of just change the way that they're working with kids and helping them see what sports are really about. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation that I think could have gone on for another hour or two.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, I've got my takeaways, and sweet friends, I know you have yours. Let's discuss them. Come up on Facebook. You can go to the Dr. Robyn Silverman page, or let's chat about it at drrobynsilverman.com or twitter.com/drrobyn. Also on Instagram at drrobynsilverman.com. And we'll be going back and forth on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram with John, sharing memes, talking about this episode. I will be taking some of his great quotes and putting them right on memes so we can share them everywhere. I know you love to do that. And if you love this podcast like I did, I'll hope you go up to iTunes and rate and review it so others can learn about these outstanding solutions and ways to talk to kids and use them in their own homes. I truly appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. My fellow parents, leaders, and educators, thank you so much for tuning in to How to Talk to Kids About Anything. For more information on books, articles, speaking engagements, or curriculum, please visit drrobynsilverman.com. There's great podcasts up there, and the show notes to this podcast will be up there as well. I look forward to weathering the storms and enjoying the sunny side of life together. And please remember, even on the days when you fall short, you've got this. You're here. You're getting the information you need. I know it's not easy, but never forget there's always tomorrow. Parenting is the ultimate do-over. So if you heard something today that John said and you go, oh gosh, I said that very thing on the soccer field, in the gymnastics gym, in wherever you might have been, and you go, I said the wrong thing. Do not worry. You can take this information and say to your kid, you know what? I didn't mean to say that. Here's what I meant to say. I love watching you play. I see you. I'm right there with you. And as there are moments when we doubt our know-how, our choices, and our sweet sanity, please know you're 10 times the parent you think you are. Until next time, this is Dr. Robyn Silverman with How to Talk to Kids About Anything. Please tune in again and keep connecting through conversation. See you next week.
You've been listening to How to Talk to Kids About Anything with Dr. Robyn Silverman. For more information on books, articles, speaking engagements, or curriculum, please visit drrobynsilverman.com.